Children's homes were established in Western Europe to rehabilitate Jewish youth. Because children are flexible, it was a much easier task. Children had the ability to forget. Exposed to the sun, they prepared for eventual settlement in Palestine. Fed nutritious food and surrounded by loving counselors, helping to erase their memories of starvation and cruelty. For many of the stateless adults, there was an underground movement to lead them illegally across various frontiers to the Promised Land. Immigration was limited by the British, contrary to the League of Nations mandate. This underground movement, the largest in history, led by Jews from Palestine, was responsible for transporting 300,000 displaced persons. At times, they traveled by night in truck convoys to isolated beaches for the secret journey. Although Palestinian Jews had served in the war with great distinction, the avowed foreign policy of the British at the time was to maintain a balance between Arab and Jewish populations in the Holy Land. Great numbers of displaced persons boarded old charter boats, overloaded beyond capacity. They dreamed of successfully running the British blockade and of a new life in Palestine. Due to overcrowding, the passengers endured hardship, but were buoyed by hope. Entire families lived packed together in tiny quarters with hardly room to lie down, stacked one on top of the other in tiers below deck, a precaution taken should a British reconnaissance plane fly over the ship. It would appear then like a simple freighter, with no evidence of the great mass of humanity on board. The plan was to elude the warships of the British fleet and sail to secret beaches in Palestine. At times, the refugees were allowed a little freedom. They were accustomed to bare sanitary facilities and short food supply. They tried keeping themselves clean with a little water on hand. Mothers prayed that their children would be raised in a different world. Group leaders saw to it that rations were carefully distributed, and there was a strong communal spirit present. Even after so much suffering and death, somehow the spark, the will to survive, persisted. People prayed in the open with their sacred tallis, tefillin, and prayer book, praying to the God of Jacob to deliver them once again from bondage and wandering. Babies were born on the ship, new life to replace that which had been extinguished. but not many such ships reached the promised land. With their goal almost within reach, these people were sent below. The pilot guessed the truth of the situation, and very shortly the passengers saw a British destroyer appear on the horizon. Concern for the safety of the women and children aboard made the group decide not to resist. There was nothing to do except come up for a gasp of fresh air and wait anxiously as the British vessel approached. A banner of the underground ship was proudly unfurled. Silently, they waited for the escort. Their hope of reaching Palestine shattered. Their future destiny uncertain. Later, with British Marines aboard, the ship was permitted to sail into the harbor of Haifa. But the people were virtual prisoners. Their stay would be short. Just time enough to load at dockside into prison ships, bound for the detention camps on the nearby island of Cyprus. They were led up the gangplanks into the barbed wire enclosures and taken to the Cyprus detention camps. At the UN headquarters at Lake Success, speaker after speaker deplored the spectacle of Jews being once again imprisoned because of politics. And so in November of 1947, the United Nations agreed on a plan to partition the country of Palestine into two parts, Arab and Jewish states, with a provision that the British were to leave the land by May 15th, 1948. On that day, the British did indeed leave from Haifa port, taking with them their troops, soldiers happy to return to their own families, free at last of their unpleasant involvement in the currents of Jewish destiny. In a small lecture hall of the Tel Aviv Museum, David Ben-Gurion, the head of a provisional council, proclaimed the State of Israel. King Abdullah of Jordan, commander-in-chief of the combined Arab forces, gave the order for the immediate invasion of Israel. At the same time, the underground Jewish army, the Haganah, using whatever equipment they could lay hands on, came out into the open to defend themselves. The population remained calm in the face of air raids, which the Arabs launched against Jewish cities. With outdated weapons, the Jews fought against bombers and succeeded in driving them off, although not without loss. Fighting valiantly with small arms against the planes and tanks of the Arab world, the Israelis fought in settlements and villages throughout the country. In Jerusalem, Arab artillery opened a barrage against the civilian population. As they always had, Jews first rescued the scrolls of the law. Many watched as their homes were destroyed by shells of the British-trained and led Arab Legion. Israeli convoys, risking ambush, brought food to beleaguered Jerusalem, and the Jewish population, fighting as one man, countered the tremendous military establishment of the combined Arab world. Settlers in rural areas were cut off from any assistance. Fighting off sporadic attacks, they saw their harvests burned to the ground by Arab marauders. Children, among the first to suffer in wartime, were evacuated in homemade armored cars. The adults stayed behind and continued their work on the land as best they could, at the same time ready at a moment's notice to take up arms to defend themselves. They had no alternative, a weapon in itself. They were determined not to be decimated as so many millions of their brothers had been in Europe. If they had to die, they wanted to die fighting for their right to live. With the sea at their backs, the Israelis watched the work of many years on the land, crops and building projects reduced to rubble. Still they fought on, for they had no alternative. In the same places where birds sang were to be found mounds of freshly turned earth. However, the enemy also lost many men in senseless carnage. At last, the Arab states agreed to an armistice. With the assistance of the United Nations, the last of several armistices was arranged in 1949. President Weizmann received the first ambassadors from the United States and Russia. Jews were returned to Israel who had been captured during the fighting, and a great victory celebration was held. Soldiers from all over the country assembled in the city of Tiberias for review by the new Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. The few planes the Israeli forces now possessed flew overhead, and the rather ragtag but victorious troops paraded smartly before the leaders of the new state. A final resting place of young Israelis who gave their lives so that their nation might live. The destruction was cleared away. The artisans returned to peaceful work, rebuilding what had been destroyed, picking up the thread of normal life. The first problem was to recreate what was in ruins and to move ahead in a land independent and free. a land of peace with great prospects for the future. At the United Nations, a vote was taken.
Please. Abstain. Parama. Yes. That satisfies the requirement of the Charter of a two-thirds majority, and I therefore formally declare Israel admitted to membership in the United Nations.
Later, Moshe Sharet accepted for the State of Israel.
Represents the collective statesmanship of the world in a spirit of humility, anxious for guidance and enlightenment. We hope that our ability to learn may be enhanced by the ancient teachings and age-old aspirations of the Jewish people, who bequeathed to the world the vision of a time when nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Lo yissa goy el goy xerev velo yilmedu od milchama.
The time had come for the ingathering of all those who wished to return. And they came from both eastern and western countries. In Yemen, some 50,000 Jews lived as second-class citizens under oppressive Arab potentates. The ruler of Yemen agreed to accept ransom for the Jews in his land, enabling them to begin a new life in Israel. Rations were given out to family heads of those who would make the trip. The Jews were loaded onto trucks to be taken to the airport, where they would board chartered American aircraft. These Yemenite Jews had hardly ever seen an automobile, much less a commercial airplane. The journey was the eagerly awaited miracle of the Lord's deliverance. The young led the old. They believed in the words of the ancient idiom, more than the Jewish people had kept the Torah. The Torah had kept the Jewish people. Those who remained behind for the next plane waved as the first group of Yemenites started Operation Magic Carpet. They said goodbye to a land where they had lived for generations, but left without regret. Winging their way, the prophetic vision from the Bible ringing in their ears, that on the wings of eagles will they be delivered to the promised land. The Yemenites felt this was indeed a biblical prophecy fulfilled. Soon the rugged coast of Arabia disappeared below them. Then, sighting the shores of Israel, the end of their modern-day exodus. Like all newcomers in the beginning, they lived under canvas, but they were home. Their ways were similar to the East, but they had always retained the book, the holy word of the Lord, to guide them and teach their children. Bathing out of a pot, but the new generation of children would be the leaders of tomorrow. other immigrants, too. People from 113 different countries, speaking 76 different languages, arrived to help build the land. Meanwhile, the fledgling heads of the new nation met to conduct the affairs and create facilities for the burgeoning population. At the top of the list of priority needs, proper housing for the immigrants. Large areas of the state of Israel had to be cleared and wells dug in the rocky soil. A laborious and time-consuming job because of the lack of mechanized equipment, counterbalanced by the enthusiasm of the workers. Again, as throughout the years, a symphony of construction activity, accomplished with great vigor by many willing hands. The dynamic tempo of the country affecting all, dreams being realized after a millennium of oppression, and the continued struggle for survival. Houses went up by the thousands of family units, evolving from canvas to proper concrete dwellings. The people of Israel were not out of the trenches yet, nor would they be for many years to come. At the very time irrigation ditches were being dug and water pipes laid, they remained alert, even as they labored. Life in the frontier settlements went on. Some found time for artistic pursuits. Others prepared food in a makeshift kitchen. Children were cared for in a communal house, while their fathers and mothers labored in the fields. Day-to-day chores, such as the community laundry, had to be taken care of. Chickens fed and geese tended. The sentry was never far away. Many times after a hard day's work, a man left for all-night guard duty, saying goodbye to his family, not knowing whether he would live to see them the next day. For there were numerous attacks by the Fedayeen, the Egyptian terror squads who ventured across the borders. Local police struggled to deal with the grisly harvest of tragedy which these invaders left behind. These events sickened the people who, after 8 years of harassment and murder, called for a cessation of terrorism and just retribution. Of 1956, the Israeli army, by now equipped with modern weapons, moved into Sinai against a massed Egyptian army in order to knock out the supply bases from which the terrorists had been operating and reopen the illegally blockaded Straits of Tiran. Israeli paratroopers dropped from transport planes landed well behind the enemy lines in the parched and barren Sinai desert. Infantry going into battle against the always numerically superior Arab forces, against their superior weaponry, but not superior human raw material. The roads of Sinai were dotted with destroyed Russian-made armor. An unending stream of Arab prisoners and captured Soviet equipment. Enough to keep an army supplied for years, seized by the Israeli forces during the campaign. Though the victories had been hard won, Israel in 1957 agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula in return for international commitments. Peace and life returned to normal. Another beginning, more buildings constructed, water resources harnessed. The conquest of the desert continued, large irrigation plans developed. For 10 years, Israel enjoyed comparative peace until the spring of 1967. And then a new threat of war emerged. Terrorists again did their murderous work. Armistice agreements held no meaning for these youngsters whose communal house had been destroyed. Like the reliving of an old nightmare, the incidents increased. The Arab world continued its provocations. Arab leaders met, and a new war for Israel's destruction was planned. In Arab capitals, the soldiers marched not too well, but with great determination to drive the Israelis into the sea. While in Tel Aviv, crowds assembled in silent demonstrations to call for the reopening of the international straits of Tiran, again illegally closed by Egyptian forces. In vain, Israel waited for the international commitments made 10 years before to be honored. Diplomats like Abba Eban labored in world capitals and were disappointed. The United Nations, after a single order from Nasser, had pulled their peacekeeping forces. Thus, the last shred of hope of a peaceful settlement disappeared. Israeli leaders solemnly met in closed session to determine their people's destiny. Civil defense training was vigorously practiced, as it had been in times of tension during the past 20 years. Israel prepared for the worst. Sandbags were filled during the night, men, women, and children pitching in together to do what they could, readying themselves for yet another round against the Arabs' all-out attempt to destroy the Jewish state. This time, blood not senselessly shed, but willingly given. And everywhere, tension in the faces of the populace. The Israeli army was confident even though they faced masses of enemy soldiers and 900 enemy planes poised for offensive action. Delta-winged French-built Mystère jets piloted by Israelis took off to meet the incoming Egyptian MiGs with spectacular results. MiGs alone do not a mighty nation make. Tanks and half-tracks went into battle. Soldiers determined that the Jewish people would continue to live. Light spotter planes found targets for the mobile self-propelled guns. Oil fires on the horizon, attesting to the accuracy of the Israeli gunners. Pounding to twisted metal, the remaining armor of the once proud Egyptian army in Sinai, reminiscent of 1956. Moved forward without rest all along the wide southern front in unrelenting night and day assaults, pausing only to pay homage to their supreme commander. A firm biblical belief that the hand of the Almighty had confounded the enemy. Into the Arab coastal city of Gaza. Stragglers of the boastful enemy, now prisoners. Israeli mortar crews moved into action to neutralize occasional strong points. Soldiers in mobile jeeps, using automatic machine gun fire to erase the last traces of Arab resistance. And always the command forward, the battle cry of the Israeli army. Into Al-Arish, formerly a key airfield of the Egyptian Air Force in Sinai. Many more prisoners. This time, a Major General, interrogated by Israeli intelligence. The faces of the captives showing strain and bewilderment. Most did not even know the names of their commanders. The Arab soldiers, essentially from the peasant class, would only run with their shoes off. The high price of victory paid for in Israeli blood, and other Israeli soldiers celebrating a victory in a classic way. Forward towards the Suez Canal zone, past still burning reminders of the armed might of the Russian-equipped Egyptian army. Then the thin ribbon of the canal, peaceful and deserted, the bridge at Ismailia, which had been destroyed by the fleeing Egyptians, fearful that they would be pursued to the other side. The Israeli commanders paused to evaluate the situation. Their orders were not to go further. The soldiers took a well-earned rest and made use of the first unrationed water to refresh themselves. General Yitzhak Rabin, Israeli Chief of Staff, visited the Soviet missile site and placed near the canal, which was aimed at the heart of Israel. General Rabin inspected the Great Bitter Lake area, where ships had been stranded because of the Egyptian blockade of the Suez Canal. The guns at the Straits of Tiran, now blown apart, lay silent. And at Sharm el-Sheikh, the Israelis landed unopposed. Israeli PT boats dominated the waterway to their southern port, Eilat, on the Red Sea, while to the north, Israeli bombers went into action against Syrian fortifications on the Golan Heights, whose guns had been pounding the villages of northern Israel for 20 years. The Israelis knifed forth with their tanks and bulldozers, creating their own roads on the steep approaches. Up the treacherous incline, the tough Israeli fighters pushing ever forward, against all odds. Syrian prisoners still dazed by the all-out onslaught. Overlooking from the Golan Heights, the now very peaceful Hula Valley of Israel. Kenitra, the second largest city in Syria, entered by Israeli forward elements who found it deserted. Israeli casualties were taken back by boat across the Sea of Galilee. The seriously wounded were evacuated by helicopter to hospitals and onto operating tables within 15 or 20 minutes from the time they fell, accounting for the relatively small loss of life. For these men, the war was over even before the ceasefire went into effect. Shelled by Jordanian forces, despite the fact that the Israelis had begged young King Hussein to stay out of the fight. Indiscriminate shelling by the Jordanian guns resulted in many civilian casualties and fires. Shoes and prisoners. East Jerusalem. Shortly after, the hard-fighting Israeli forces had overwhelmed the Jordanian Legion and reunified the city. Civilian refugees returning to their homes, and some lost boys being returned to their families. At the Wailing Wall, the great moment, as General Moshe Dayan, Israeli Minister of Defense, appeared before the historic remnant of the ancient temple. The soldiers present poured out their hearts, a feeling of closeness and attachment to the 3,000 years of Jewish history that went before them, that now stood symbolically in the form of a wall that they could touch, weep, and pray by. Men and women of all ages, white beards and the clean-shaven, civilians and soldiers, guns at the ready, and prayer books in their hands. Several days later, the Feast of Shavuot, commemorating the giving of the Torah, was a scene of joyous celebration. Jews went back to the tomb of the patriarchs. Pieces of paper with wishes traditionally inserted between the stones. And the Hasidim dancing their joyful dances at the tomb of Abraham. Freedom for all religions now. People able to pray as they wish. Jerusalem at peace again. Christians called to worship. The muezzin calling to the faithful of Allah in the length and breadth of the land. Prayers that at long last the conflict and the bloodshed was at an end. But bitter experience had taught the Israelis that the best hope of peace was rooted in preparedness, and the military was prepared to meet any threat to the country. Throughout history, the Jewish people had fought against all odds for their right to exist. A memorial for the fallen who had made the supreme sacrifice. And then a concert on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem, attended by both dignitaries and ordinary citizens. The sounds of music replacing the sounds of war. A land of promise and fulfillment. A country growing, flourishing. Orchards poking up from barren land. Houses rising in the wilderness. And farmers sowing their seed. The harvest to be reaped by generations to come. I will give peace in the land, and none shall make you afraid. People at work, those with numbers on their arms, and those from the Arab world, now living as free men in the state of Israel. Arab schools teaching the Quran in the Arabic language. The Arab minority following their own cultural pursuits in a pluralistic society. The young and the old, immigrants and native-born, from different backgrounds, living and working together in a dynamic democracy, striving for a secure and peaceful future. Israel, a hot land conceived in dreams, hewn out of biblical rock by hand, moistened with the blood of martyrs, sustained by faith, a miracle of survival.